Welcome to the stream. Colombia despierta. Colombia awake. That is the hashtag connected to the country's biggest protests in years. And people are still raising their voices after nearly 2 weeks of demonstrations. I'm Femi Okay.
I'm Malika Bilal. As thousands of people take to the streets again today, we want to hear your thoughts on what's next for Colombia. Get in touch through Twitter and YouTube, and you can be part of today's conversation.
It's now 13 days since hundreds of thousands of people held wide-ranging protests against Colombia's government, and people are back out on the streets again.
The demonstrations have been joined by people from all walks of life, with labor unions, student movements, and indigenous groups among those leading the way. Protesters are now leading a third general strike after talks between the government and the National Strike Committee failed to make progress, and they have a long list of grievances.
We are protesting because of the new reforms that the government has tried to impose on us. Really, the Congress and the Council are only helping themselves. They aren't helping the needy people of the country, and that doesn't help us as workers.
This is a peaceful protest because the only thing we want is peace in Colombia. We can overcome the rest, but peace is what we need urgently.
If the president doesn't listen to us, we'll continue the strike until we're heard, either the easy way or the hard way.
For more on this, we are joined from Cali in Western Colombia by Manuel Rosenthal, an activist who has joined the protests.
From the capital, Bogota, we have Gabriel Santos, a congressman with the ruling Democratic Center Party.
And also in Bogota, Sergio Guzman. He's director at Colombia Risk Analysis, which provides forecasts on Colombia's political and security situation. Hello, everybody. Sergio, you saw there the comments from protesters in the streets. We recorded them just a few hours ago, and they spoke to the stream specially. When you look at who is out on the streets, who is striking, are you surprised by the variety of protesters?
Yeah, Femi, actually, the diversity of the protest is something that gives the protest a lot of strength, but it's also something that makes the protest weak, because the number of demands and the number of requests, the objectives of the protest tend to be diffuse among such a large group of people.
So I'm just thinking, Manuel, you've been out there, you've been striking. What do you want to happen?
Well, first of all, this is an expression of an indignation that has been kept for a long time, an indignation against an establishment. And I'd say three things I'd like to see happen. The first one is that the main reforms that the government is trying to introduce and the worst policies, that the government actually backs off from them. The second one is that the government and the establishment realize that there are hundreds of thousands, millions of people in Colombia that do not like them, that are fed up with them and didn't have a chance to say it as we have before. And the third and the most important one is for us, for the most of Colombian people, and it's around what Sergio just stated, is that we have a debt amongst ourselves and this country to weave an agenda by the people, from the people, for the people, that is not built by others and imposed on us. And that is a long process, yes.
Manuel, that was such a clear and concise list of things that the protesters want and are calling for. What's not as clear and concise is a few tweets that I want to share with you to actually hope that you can pick them apart for us. Because when we asked our community and people online why it is they're taking to the streets, why it is they're protesting, we got back several answers. I'll share just two. This first one from someone who says, I would like to start by mentioning the main reasons why people are protesting against the government. It all started with the assassinations of social leaders that were reported. And most of these reports began increasing after Duque was elected. So that's one person's thoughts. Another, though, Maria on Twitter says, what sparked this strike, the biggest strike in Colombian modern history, was the current labor and pension reforms and proposals that ultimately could affect the most vulnerable sectors of society: farm workers, young people, low-income class families. So, Manuel, two very different reasons from people online, but that is why both of them are out in the streets. Can you pick apart that for us?
Yes, absolutely. They are all truth, and there are more missing, and that's exactly what's happening. So much built up, so many reasons. Like the government had to acknowledge the fact that it had targeted a guerrilla camp and had murdered children and covered it up. At least 8, and there are reports of more than 300 in 8 years. We'll see if that's true. There are reports also, and we know the fact that there are more than 700 leaders of this country, unarmed leaders, murdered throughout the country without any serious protection towards them. And then, worst, on top of this all, when the mobilization comes out against educational, pension, tax reforms, and others, then the government goes ahead yesterday, the party in power goes ahead yesterday, insulting the protest and approves in the first instance the very reforms we are protesting against. So exactly what you're seeing are not different reasons. What you're seeing is one huge reason. We are fed up.
Gabriel, so much for you to pick up on there. Where do you want to start?
Well, I would like to say I respectfully disagree with what Manuel is stating for various reasons. I believe this is a very legitimate protest, that these hard times for Colombian democracy must prove to be the opportunity to have these big discussions as a society we must have. But some of the premises Manuel stated are not accurate or false. Let's start with the pension reform, which was basically, if I read the situation right, one of the first requests people were marching upon. And sorry, there's a kind of a fireworks. I'm just 100 meters away from the protest. So they were saying the government wanted to introduce this very strict pension reform and to reduce the salary of young people in Colombia, and they all are absolute lies. There hasn't been the discussion of a pension reform. There is no law introduced by government that talks about the pension reform, and there is no law introduced by the government that talks about reducing the salary to young people. These have been talks mostly from private sector entities that have commented upon these issues. They have made these recommendations. International organizations like the OECD, I don't know what the acronym is in English, but they have stated we need a pension reform because the way we are subsidizing high pensions in Colombia is very unstable, and will not allow young people to pension in the future. Social leaders, it's something very troublesome for Colombia as a society. It's something that is very difficult to digest for anyone in the political spectrum, but it's something that hasn't been happening recently. It's something that you cannot take upon the national government elected a year, somewhat a little bit more of a year ago, and it's not their exclusive responsibility. This has been happening since the peace deal was signed, and it has been happening because we have a very difficult conflict, for example, with illicit crops in Colombia.
So Gabriel, just take a pause for a moment, because I have a feeling that Sergio wants to ask you something. Sergio,
yes, of course.
Go ahead.
No, I mean, the issue, I think, is important, because mentioning the peace agreement is something that I feel is worth noting. I feel that was an important break in our body politic. And now I think that there's a lot of reasons that people are upset, also because of the government's resistance to implementing the peace agreement. So in a way, these things had been festering for a while, that are coming out in large part because of insatisfaction with the government, to Manuel's point. But I think you have a good point when you talk about pension reform. I don't think that we've been having a civilized discussion about what that means and what we should do as a country for that. There's been much disinformation about that. but people are angry also in part because of that.
So I want to bring in another voice before we get too much further on one of the reasonings behind why people are angry. This is a video comment we got from Silvia Otero. She's a professor of political science at the University of Rosario in Bogota, and here's what she told the stream.
Before, political violence was at the center of public debates. But with the FARC gone, people started to pay attention to other things like inequality, corruption, pensions, health and education, and are protesting for all of those things. Many people feel very frustrated because they wanted to turn the page of political violence for good, and that is not happening.
Gabriel, what do you make of what she's saying about this is why we are seeing people protest about things we didn't see in the past?
Well, I would be somewhere in the middle. I don't think that that's absolutely right. I think that the peace process, of course, opened the political space to start discussing things that hadn't been in the top of our political agenda for the past 50 years. I would agree with that. But I don't think that's the only reason we're seeing this protest. These protests have been, in the beginning, summoned based on arguments that are very difficult to undertake by one government. For example, we see some people angry about the International Monetary Fund. Some people and other protesters are asking for the peace process to be completed. Other people are being taken to the streets based on falsehoods or lies. So it's very difficult to understand where this protest comes from. And I would agree with the comment made earlier about this is going to be a very long protest because of the difficulty to understand first who leads the protest. So who do you have to sit and what are their legitimate requests? Sure. And how can you transfer those requests into the political, into Congress, for example, and then come with an outcome they would agree with. So it's very difficult to see where this is coming from.
Gabriel, on the point of who leads the protests, just yesterday, one of the members of the National Strike Committee was talking about the strike that we can hear a little bit of outside of where you're sitting right now. And this is what he said about the plan for today.
We continue carrying out our acts of mobilization that we have planned to December 10 for now, and we've been very clear with this in asking for the highest guarantees from the government. We want all the exercises to be absolutely peaceful. Regarding tomorrow, we've put forward to the government that they shouldn't bring out the anti-riot police to create a more calm scene. We hope to carry out a peaceful, colorful event with this Christmas season that's already broken out in the country.
Gabriel, you're right there. Is it peaceful outside your window?
It is. It has been a mostly peaceful process. There are some fireworks which are legal, but I can see some fireworks through my window.
All right.
But it has been a mostly peaceful protest, but we have been seeing continuously these very, very violent acts. We had 2 very difficult nights in Bogota last week with riots, people destroying public and private property. So I understand why he doesn't want to see the anti-riot police in the streets. But it's very important to understand that this is not an anti-protest police unit. This is an anti-riot police unit.
Okay.
With its difficulties and that we have seen in the past week.
All right, let's just step back a little bit. Let's look at the last 15 months of your the ruling party, just looking at how they've performed. Manuel, it seems like this is frustrations that have been building up for some time. If you had to review the president's last 15 months, what would you say? What's happened?
Yeah, first with providing you with background. This political party in power and this president in power has actually been part of a government that was re-elected in the past. President Uribe is the figure behind this. So it's not just these 15 months. The responsibility goes for a longer period of time, and I disagree with the senator who's presenting that like this is a long-standing problem and we can't fix it in 15 months. No, you've been part of the problem for a longer period of time. And I'll mention some things that are very important. First of all, your Minister of Defense had to resign over several scandals that were made public before they were made in Colombia. They were made public in the New York Times, including the fact that the general commander of the armed forces was made the commander of the armed forces when evidence came out in the New York Times that he had been involved in false positives, which is the assassination of civilians that were later shown as. Second, last week only, the anti-riot police murdered, and the images are everywhere, and the examination, the autopsy proved it, murdered Dylan Cruz and angered everybody. And yesterday, a 15-year-old indigenous guard was run over in Chocó. So it has been a very aggressive government. It has been a very aggressive armed forces, and they have been involved in scandal after scandal of brutality, of corruption, and of all kinds of abuses, not the least of which is the assassination of Dimar Torres, one of the many assassinated, demobilized FARC people, who was captured with his friend. Let me just finish this statement. That case should be known by everybody everywhere in the world. This man was castrated, brutally tortured, and then killed and covered up by the Minister of Health. So please don't say that it's not the responsibility of this government. And this government yesterday approved a tax reform.
So Manuel, allow Gabriel to respond to you. These are important allegations and reports that you are bringing out to an international community. Gabriel, go ahead.
Of course, except he said there are no reforms. But they approved 3 reforms yesterday.
And this is part of the problem. And you can see why people are striking, and some of the people don't understand why they're striking. And this is because people sometimes call upon them with absolute lies, like some of which Manuel has just said. The case of Dimar Torres was absolutely brutal, and and a member of the army was convicted just last week because of this, but he was never mutilated, as he said, and this was one of the falsehoods that was, and this doesn't make it any less hurtful. But they tried to put some false facts in between these very real denounces as he has just made, and our armed forces have been very forthcoming in these acts of corruption, which some of them have been denounced by the same armed forces, and the president has been very strict, saying asking our district attorney to investigate them. And Manuel was still talking about these reforms, and I'll show you one of the big problems of this protest. Colombian people are saying that we as a party, the Centro Democrático, introduced a reform in order to have less hours per week. And this is partly true, and they're calling upon the young people to say that we want them to work less and therefore earn less. But if they would take the law we presented and read it very carefully, they would understand that we're asking for the work week to go from 48 hours to 45 hours without discount in pay. I am not entirely in agreement with this proposal, but that's what the texts say. So they're taking these proposals and they're kind of mixing them with half-truths or blatant lies and asking people to go out to the streets.
If I could just
So I hear what you're saying. I want to bring in a point here based on a few things that were said. This is someone who's weighing in on the killing of Dylan Cruz, who you mentioned. They write that after he was killed, most students and protesters demanded Duque dismantle the riot police, who had been using force through tear gas, kicking or punching every single person they saw. However, he denied to do it, and instead he proposed 3 days without the VAT tax. So this is one person's account of that, and that is how it's playing out to people online, people who are out in the streets. I want to share the comment of 2 more people because I want to push this on a little bit, and I think it's all under the umbrella, people are telling us, of lack of governance. So this is Leah on Twitter, who says, as days have passed, thousands of Colombian citizens have joined marches to express their anger. People are tired of the fear and of violence. We have a peace accord, and it hasn't been fully implemented. So it's on the peace accord that I want to push this conversation onto via a video comment from a reporter. Her name is Frances Jenner. She's a writer at the Latin American Reports in Medellin, and here's what she says.
Since Ivan Duque came into office, his popularity rating has dropped by 27%. Although he has raised the minimum salary and the fact that Colombia is one of the fastest growing economies in the region at the moment, there are still a lot of frustrations against his administration. One of these is his incompliance with the 2016 peace agreement and the fact there is not enough protection for social leaders. Since the peace agreement, 700 social leaders and activists have been killed. In Colombia, there is also rising unemployment, and Duque tried to implement a paquetazo, a series of pension and labor reforms, privatizations, and tax increases. And these, along with many, many other reasons, are why people are on the streets protesting in Colombia.
So, Sergio, she mentioned several things that we've touched on. It's the non-protection and it's the non-compliance, she says, to this peace agreement. Why does that matter right now? And do you see either of those things changing in people's eyes?
Yeah, and no, and if you look at what Manuel and Congressman Santos are arguing, this is how we are as a society. We're deeply divided, and we can't find a path forward. And a lot of people are complaining that the country seems to be rudderless because President Duque has been unable to join the different parties and join the different sides to cast a common narrative and a common vision for the country. I feel that, if you could allow me, I feel that one of the problems is that the ruling Democratic Center Party is in and of itself a minority party and can't pass laws. And it needs to get support from independent parties to be able to move forward. But the issue is it's very difficult to find compromise between members of the Democratic Center Party itself and within members of the Democratic Center and other independent parties in the middle. So many people have been observing that it's hard for President Duque to pass legislation, and what it takes to pass legislation is a lot of compromise, and I think at the moment we're not having any.
Just talking about compromise, Sergio, this is what President Duque, said just a few days ago about talking to the strikers. Have a listen.
Colombia has seen many declarations from youth. Last year, we heard the demands of youth, and I want the space to open up a conversation where experts, professors, students, activists, researchers, parliamentarians can, despite perhaps their political differences, arrive at a common ground that transcends and which favorably impacts social justice in our country.
Gabriel, is that conversation started yet? Is it happening right now?
It has.
Yeah.
It has been going on. The National Strike Committee denied to sit with the government because they weren't willing to talk to different sectors of the society that were not inside that National Strike Committee, which I believe was a huge mistake. This is, as I stated earlier, this is a very good opportunity to try and promote those reforms and that legislation that we have been unable to pass in Congress. I largely agree with Sergio's statement before. It's very difficult for us as a party and for President Duque as a president to pass legislation in the current state of Colombian Congress. But it's very difficult to talk to someone who doesn't want to talk to you. It's very difficult to talk to someone whose main belief is they want to change the way a democratically elected leader has been what his political stance is. So I believe we have to find some compromise within the government.
Finding some compromise.
Our government has to listen, and we have to find some compromise within the National Strike Committee in order to get into a middle ground where we can start talking about that legislation.
All right, Manuel, you've got one more sentence just to wrap us up with. What will you say to us?
Yes, the president in the entire history of this country that has refused more than anybody else a dialogue with anybody that criticizes him has been Duque, and has refused, and not only that, he has refused to even listen to 70 experts that wrote to him yesterday, economists, against these reforms.
Manuel Rosenthal,
refused
Gabriel Santos, Sergio Guzman, thank you for being on our show today. We really appreciate it. And you can find myself and Malika always online, so keep sending your comments through Twitter, YouTube, aljazeera.com/the stream. Bye for now.